literacy leaders and champions. Welcome to Literacy Talks, the podcast series from Reading Horizons, dedicated to exploring the ideas, trends, insights, and practical issues that will help us create literacy momentum. Our series host is Stacy Hurst, professor at Southern Utah University and Chief Academic Officer at Reading Horizons, where reading momentum begins. Joining Stacy are Donell Pons, a recognized expert in literacy and special education, and Lindsay Kemeny, a Utah-based elementary classroom teacher. Today's topic gives you a valuable recap of the recent Society for the Scientific Study of Reading Conference. It's almost better than being there in person. Let's get started.
Welcome to this episode of Literacy Talks. My name is Stacy Hurst, and I'm joined each week by my fantastic co-hosts, Donell Pons and Lindsay Kemeny. Those of you who've been joining us for a while know that each episode we take turns deciding the topic. Today's topic is actually Donell's, and I know it will be fascinating. So Donell, what are we talking about today?
So today we're going to talk about a conference that I attended in July. And it's a conference that I have never attended before, and nobody else had either. And so this is going to be new for us. And it's the Society for the Scientific Study of Reading. They hold an annual conference. A lot of times it's in really interesting locations internationally. And so it can be difficult or challenging to get to the conference. This year, it was in Newport, California. And so it was nearby relatively to us. And so I thought, I'm going to go. And that was July. Okay, just have to make a note here. I've complained bitterly in many different locations. I'll stop doing it soon. But went in July. COVID numbers were high in California. My husband and I have been those lucky few in the 2.5 years we have not had COVID. To our knowledge, we did not have COVID. Now that I've had it, we did not have COVID before because it left a mark. Anyway, we go down to California and I attend the conference, get back, and it's just as I arrive back, we're obviously sick. And then people from the conference started posting that COVID was rampant and, please get tested. Anyway, I risked COVID for you guys. So that's what I brought back for you. Right?
So sorry, Donell.
You are such a true
taking one for the team.
Yes, what a team player. But you know what, though, I do remember something you said right after you got back. It was worth getting COVID for.
I know. I said that. And I think I still mean it, even after all these weeks of coughing. I think I still mean it. So for those who are not aware of this whole Society for the Scientific Study of Reading, it's a relatively new organization, considering some go way back to the 30s, but about 1995, there's an individual named Ron Carver, who's considered the father of SSSR, the 3SR conference. And it was interesting. I was reading some reflections of folks who eventually joined the organization, that he was really on his own in setting this up. And he wanted to have a really rigorous environment for folks who were doing research on reading specifically to present and to share. And one of the hesitations of some of the researchers was, well, if we get too siloed, too specific about the research that we're doing and that it's reading and we only have it here, we might be left out of other journals, scientific journals. And I thought that was kind of an interesting concern. Unfounded, apparently, over the years, that was not the case. And then this conference has become extremely valuable. And many of the individuals who have joined have talked about how it has really filled a role for them. So just that little background to give you. And then the reason I wanted to attend for years is because one of my favorites in the world of reading and reading research and compiling that information, helping us understand it, is Dr. David Kilpatrick. And early on, when he presented on his book, Essentials of Assessing, Preventing, and Overcoming Reading Difficulties, about 2015, when I was talking to him, he said, that's a conference you really ought to go to. And I remember all wide-eyed and saying to him, I don't feel like I could go to anything called the Society for the Scientific Study of Reading. I would be out of my league. And he explained, no, you really need to go. This is where you'll meet the people who actually do the research. And it's really fascinating to get a firsthand account from the researchers. And so that was always in the back of my mind. And finally, when it was nearby, I went. And you know what? His description was exactly correct. It's really nice to have a firsthand account from the individuals who are conducting the research. Sure, there's plenty that's over our heads if you're not researchers and always steeped in this, but there was enough there to really listen to the conversations, to see not only what the research was telling us, but also the limitations of research. That was also interesting, and that the researchers themselves have these conversations too about what you can extrapolate from the research and what isn't quite there. They also discuss how challenging it is for instructors, for teachers, educators in any setting, whether it's a small tutoring, whether it's a whole classroom, how difficult it is for them to take on this research, implement it correctly, and only as far as the research itself says you can, right? And so that was another interesting thing to hear them talking about that. So to get started, I have a lot of information. When I looked at my notes, it was 4 days. Each day was divided up. I was telling the others it's kind of interesting. Each day is divided up. They try to put together the research that is related in some way into a session. Each session, the researchers get 15 minutes to present. There were about 6 to 8, depending on the subject and the time, 6 to 8 researchers that presented in that time period. And then you had someone leading the discussion at the end to kind of give an overall view. It was really interesting, and I was on my toes the whole time. It looks like I took about 14 pages of notes over those 4 days, and I was just rapidly typing to get the notes down. But I want to start off with the first one, which I thought was, and again, I didn't get to attend every session. I'm one person. I would have loved to have divided and conquered. So I missed quite a few, and there were some fantastic ones. But this one I think I want to start with today to have us kind of have a conversation, because it's been kicking around in what we've been talking about. And it was Dr. Shane Piasta from Ohio State University. And this one is really much in that K through 3, but also you could be thinking about anybody who has not made it through the steps of putting sound to letter correspondence together. She talked about some studies, and she also did a narrative review on alphabet learning, which was just kind of what we know today, not only the recent research, but what do we know? She talked about 45 studies and 4 meta-analyses that were involved in what she kind of extrapolated. And the first one was teaching names versus sounds. So we've had this conversation many times, and she says letter sounds first seems to have an advantage. Emerging evidence to teach simultaneously letter sound looks like it may be best. So I thought that was interesting. So we've thought letter sound first seems to have an advantage, but now emerging evidence seems to suggest that teaching simultaneously letter sound is best. So I want to throw that out to you two and say, what do you think of just hearing that?
First of all, Shane Piasta is one of my favorite researchers. She is a girl. I didn't know that for a long time, so I may have had a couple embarrassing conversations about her research. But that tracks with what I've experienced this summer. My students have been tutoring over the summer. One of them was tutoring a rising first grader, and my student kept expressing frustration that the student only knew the sounds of the letters, not the names. So she started teaching them together, and that made a huge difference just in the course of a summer. So that does track with even my most recent experience. Lindsay, what are your thoughts? You've taught in the kindergarten space.
Yeah,
before.
well, I was just going to cheer, woohoo, because for me, I just get some confirmation because that's what I've always done. I've always taught the letter and the name and the sound together. And, you know, I wouldn't just teach one. We have no time to waste in kindergarten, and you have to make the most of every moment. So I've always taught them together, and I've never had anyone that gets confused with that or anything like it. It was great. So I'm glad that there is, you know, this emerging research that is confirming that teaching the name and sound together is the best way.
Yeah, it seems to be preferential. Okay, so
let's move on. Did she go into detail about the ages for that, or when? Did she distinguish between pre-K and K, for example?
No, so we have all the studies. There are 45 studies. I do not have them divided up and put with the research with each statement, no.
Okay, I just wondered if it was addressed in the presentation.
So this next one I think is important because we've talked about it before, and she made the statement, no evidence to date for a preferred sequence. How do you guys feel about that one? Because boy, do we hear this a lot. You have to teach it this way. You're going to teach these letters first. You're going to do this. What do you guys say to that?
Yes, that also just confirms what I have learned. And there's so many people will be like, well, what's the science of reading way? What's the true sequence? And there is none. I think in general, you want to go in a sequence from simple to more complex, but it's not like one way of teaching the alphabet letters. One order is necessarily better than another. So
we could just list all the ways you could prioritize to order those. And I know over the years, especially Donell and I, and then when Lindsay joined our team, we've had so many conversations about this. But if you want to organize them in a way that focuses on continued sounds like versus t, if you want to organize them in a way that the name of the letter sounds like the sound the letter represents.
Or the handwriting strokes, like all the ones that start with the line or the curve. And it's so funny because I was reading, I think it was the letters manual. And on one page, it was suggesting an order for the strokes. On the next page, it was suggesting a different order for whatever reason. And I'm like, okay, but I have to choose one order. So which one do I do?
I think that's a really good point. I feel like a lot of teachers lately, they're actually starting to call it the letters sequence, and they're just choosing it because it's there and it's suggested, right? But I do think it's important to note a couple of things. Letters is a fantastic foundation. But then as teachers, if we know the research, we can make our own decisions soundly based on what the research will help us to determine. So there isn't a correct way. Some people still do it in alphabetical order.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so you guys brought up a couple of things that were interesting. What she went on to say was spacing out similar sounding or looking letters has been correlational, no real evidence to suggest this is all that helpful.
But I think it is a good point to try to separate out some confusing ones like B and D.
Or just starting by separating elemento.
I know, right?
Yeah.
They think that's a letter.
I love it.
Well, I think what this suggests is knowing your students in your classroom, right?
Mm-hmm.
So if the research suggests that there is no real order, then you're watching your students to see how are we responding, what's best for us, right? That leaves a lot of that up to the instructor.
And with one of my earliest students, which actually was my sister, I was 12 and she was learning the alphabet. But just teaching the concept of a letter, every time I had her repeat to me the letter U, she'd say me. And it was like, no, this is a letter, not a word.
Funny.
So sometimes we have to start there.
Okay, here's another one. Quicker pacing is better.
Yes. Anita Archer, perky pace, right?
Perky pace. Yep.
And I think that is dependent on revisiting, right? You're not just going to do one and done.
Because here goes the next statement she made. Incremental review and practice is important.
I think that's true of any learner. Yeah.
Here comes the next big topic, embedded mnemonics. We've had this discussion before.
Yes.
So far, some evidence, more research needed.
Some evidence for embedded mnemonics.
More evidence and research needed.
Okay. I thought that was pretty yes, we have strong research for that.
Now,
is it just older research? I mean, I remember learning about research supporting that over 10 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
Right. Stacey, you make an interesting point. Not all of this is like yesterday. Much of this research, we're going back from what do we know from 10 years ago, because that's where we still are. These are 45 studies that aren't necessarily done last year.
And lots of questions we can ask about those studies too, I guess. So when they say that they're...
Some evidence, more research needed?
Yeah, what's the end, right? More evidence for them knowing how to form the letters, more evidence for them recognizing the letters, more evidence of them connecting the sound to the letters. I guess it just depends on the study.
So the next statement is teaching, multiple opportunities to see letter form and pair that with the name and sound is advantageous. So as you're saying, more opportunities, right? And so whether that's an embedded mnemonic, or whether that's an explicit direct teaching, more opportunities, more advantageous.
And that's huge in so many areas. I think we don't give our students enough meaningful practice opportunities. So it's, we really need to focus a lot of attention there, making sure everyone has the opportunity to practice over and over.
Lindsay, I like you saying that, because how many times do we have to defend reviewing something? I mean, I've heard, we've already done this. And you have to defend the right to review, right?
And having students be involved in that review, telling is not teaching, told is not taught, right?
They have to be interactive. Yes.
And that review is another opportunity. Opportunity is we're not just sitting, right? Yeah. Okay, this was interesting. Teaching letter sound in context is not as effective. Explicit teaching is still most advantageous.
I think that makes total sense.
Yeah. Teaching letter sound in context is not as effective. Explicit teaching is still most advantageous.
So just to make sure we're all on the same page with it, Donell, can you give us an example of teaching letters sound in context?
Well, yeah. So that would be secondary learning from seeing it within another activity or something. She's talking about explicit teaching of sound and letter, right? This is the letter, this is the sound, and doing activities where it's explicit rather than, oh, look, embedded within a story or within this picture or within whatever, maybe you get a check at the sound or the letter. And you're assuming the student's getting, or a word. Yeah. And you're assuming the student's making meaning out of that.
Which makes sense. And I do have to say here, it makes sense because the second you introduce a word or a sentence, then our brains, who remember we've been attending to speech ever since we were born, basically a few months old, kick in and we start relying on that syntax and to give us a meaning, which is what we do. That's great. But when we're talking about reading, to hyper focus out of context on that letter and the sound that it's representing will be more beneficial in the long term for reading comprehension. So it makes sense to teach it in isolation and then reinforce it later in context.
Get all the resources discussed during Literacy Talks podcast episodes and stay up to date about webinars and other special events from Reading Horizons. Go to readinghorizons.com/literacy talks and subscribe to our podcast digest so you're always in the know about everything literacy.
Okay, I thought this was really good. They bring in writing because we've had this conversation too, and say that teaching alphabet instruction through writing, that the writing and handwriting instruction had very positive effects. So this is interesting for us to kind of discuss here a little bit. And the writing activities themselves, they were asking the question, were they providing the opportunity? So there isn't enough research to have pulled all that apart yet, but just having a writing piece was provided a boost in the learning of those letters and sounds. Now they're trying to pull apart. So was it the letter instruction? Was it the writing instruction? Which piece of that together was the most beneficial? But I think that's interesting. How often do you see teachers really utilizing the handwriting piece to this? How often do we see it or don't we?
I don't know. I feel like I do. I see that a lot at my school and in my classroom, but I don't know.
Yeah, and I'm glad that that's the case because I keep telling people that a hack for reading is to include writing in your instruction. But I do think it's really important to distinguish if you're using writing, they have such a reciprocal effect, right? Spelling informs reading more than reading informs spelling and so forth. But when we need to at some point separate them, meaning if you're using writing to help your students cement concepts you're teaching for reading, that is fantastic. Keep doing that. But at some point, we need to be measuring their writing ability, right? So Donell, I know I've recently heard you talk about this. What do you think is the trajectory for doing that when we're talking about instruction, reading and writing and the relationship between the two?
Yeah, I know we've talked about, it's kind of when you kind of backtrack from somebody who has gotten so far along in their education and they're still struggling with spelling and writing. And you kind of walk that back and see that from the very foundation, they didn't have this letter to sound correspondence at the heart of it. So I can't emphasize enough to educators how very important this bit we're talking about right here is, and the opportunity to practice to make sure you've got it down. If I'm not getting it, what have you got for me to help me to be able to get it? What are the tools that you're going to pull out of your bag to help me? But don't move me ahead, because I still don't have it. And that needs to be automatic, right? That's the other piece that we kind of assume about this whole thing. We've talked about the pieces for good instruction, but then what does it look like when you've done all those really good things? It's automatic. That's what it looks like. You don't have a student in the seat going, thinking, and then trying to write, pausing over, not sure how to write that letter, erasing many times, right? So we haven't even talked about this yet. We've talked about what does really good instruction look like, but then after you've done the really good instruction, how do I know? Well, that's how you know. is that it's automatic for your student, right? So I meet a lot of folks in the adult arena that was never automatic. Those pieces were never automatic, yet they moved forward. And so if you couldn't do the letters within the word, and that was challenging, then you're not going to be able to write the words that go into a sentence, and you're not going to be able to do the sentence that goes into a paragraph and the paragraphs that go to a page, right? It all becomes so much more difficult because it compounds in the writing when you're talking about writing.
Well, and when we're talking about multimodalities, when we're learning too, and I think often of our episode on the sound wall and the research that has gone into connecting that production and pronunciation of each phoneme eventually to its representation in print, the brain recognizes those sounds because of the way they're produced, the placement. It's almost as if, and I don't want to get too in the deep end here, but it's almost as if it could recognize those sound, whatever the sound was, without the sound itself. If I did this, I'm making the sound of an M, like the formation of that, my brain would recognize right, or connect it. But I'm thinking that too with letter formation and writing, and it really probably helps the brain be more fluent with writing and getting meaning across, which is why we write.
Sometimes I get frustrated because I feel like there's so much pressure put on us or put on kindergarten teachers, or at the end of kindergarten, they need to be able to write, 3 sentences. And I'm thinking, okay, can we slow down? We want to make sure that they are fluent with the strokes and they can write all their letters fluently, easily. We want to make that automatic. And I feel like sometimes we're trying to push our students too quickly before they have those foundational skills.
I agree. And I've heard it lately said we have to slow down in the beginning so we can go faster later.
Go slow to go fast.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Love it.
Lindsay, I love that you said that because that is so true. And remembering that not every student's ready for the same thing at the same time, right? So, gosh, I love that. And then that doesn't take into effect, students who may have a learning disability with, getting the aspects of writing down. Maybe it's dysgraphia, or maybe it's dyslexia and dysgraphia, and recognizing that when we allow more space in the classroom for all the students to go at the correct pace with excellent instruction, more students are going to be served, right? That's fantastic. I love that reminder. And Stacey, you made me think of a quote from Beth Phillips from the Florida Center for Reading Research that she said at the conference, and I've kicked it around in my head. Language matters, even if we never developed reading. There is no reading comprehension without oral language comprehension. Love that quote to think about for a minute, right? Language matters, even if we never developed reading. There is no reading comprehension without oral language comprehension.
That stood out to me too. And it made me remember one intervention that we orchestrated, we designed for a kindergarten student who had been raised in a home that wasn't very verbal at all. And we started there. We started by reading stories. We kind of used that as the anchor, and then having conversations with her about them. I was a reading specialist at the time, and everybody involved with that intervention was like, are you crazy? Like, that's not really going to help her read. But it was attending the language and making sure that she heard it and she could converse, and just hearing that dialogue, right?
I love that. Like, I had a conversation with an adult who loves language, oral language, has dyslexia and has just struggled to get spelling and that down, but loves oral language. And I thought, why didn't anyone ever build on that? Why didn't we build on that? And instead it was utterly ignored, which is really interesting. So at our peril, if we don't understand this, to the detriment of our students, right? Really good. Excellent. Okay. We have been at it for a while. So I know we're coming to the end of our conversation, even though we could go on for a while. But I think this has been a fantastic conversation because it hits on a lot of those foundational things that we have discussions about, right? And they continue to get kicked around. So it's nice to just refocus. So what does the research tell us up to this point? And that's what this particular presentation did, is here's what we know. Here's some of the questions that we still have. That's what I loved too, you guys, is at the end of all of the presentations, each one, they would say, we still have a lot of questions. There are a lot of questions. And I thought that was fantastic because I think we have this sense that it's set in cement and that's the definitive answer. But what it is they're as curious about learning more as any of us. And they're as curious about what this means and what the next step is as the rest of us. And I think that's fantastic, is to realize there are folks that are eagerly working on the next step.
Well, it's a scientific method, right? And I love reading research studies. I like the section that talks about limitations. And then shortly after that, it will say, what's next? It is never the end, right? Concluded, finito. And even one research study, even if it's really solid and well designed, gains power and impact when it's combined with others that are corroborating the findings in some way. Donell, one thing I do want to ask you right before we end, because you were there all during the whole conference, what is most important for us as those of us who are practitioners? How do we access that research and translate it to practice?
Well, sort of in a way. And there is a newsletter that you can get from the Society for the Scientific Study of Reading, but they say to stick close to those organizations that have always been following research in science. So the International Dyslexia Association, which also puts out a publication that brings a lot of papers together, and following real scientific review, evidence-based scientific review in publications that are well known. To stick to that information. And then I thought it was really interesting. They're open to fielding questions. So the individuals from the Florida Center for Reading Research will email, call us, reach out if you have a question. That's the other thing is there is no barrier between you and having a conversation with a researcher and getting clarification on something. They'd rather have that than have an educator having passed over a piece of information wondering, did I interpret this correctly? I'm not sure I'm doing this right. And so they would love to have you reach out. The other thing I thought was interesting is to note that some of the researchers have less experience teaching reading than educators. They're not with students all the time. That was the other thing I should have known, and you kind of should know these things, but they're young researchers. Some of them have just been researching and they haven't taught in classrooms. So all they've ever done is worked with students maybe in a lab setting. There are limitations to that. So they like hearing from educators about what you know about teaching reading in a classroom setting, because ultimately that's where this information is headed, is to mainstream into classrooms in the hands of educators. But a lot of them haven't had the experience that a lot of educators have had in teaching reading.
And to kind of end where we started, I often think of Lene Airy when she was asked how she felt about the way that teachers were implementing her research in the classroom. And she literally had no idea. She was like, oh, I don't know. Because she's a researcher. She's focused on that, not necessarily translating it. And then also, Donell, you mentioned Dr. Kilpatrick at the first of as you introduced this topic. And I have frequently heard him speak and heard him talk about approaching Dr. Airy at that conference and discussing her theory, which we now refer to as orthographic mapping, and her phases of word recognition development. And so it sounds like to bridge that research into our classrooms and practice, it takes effort on both ends, right? The researchers have to keep communicating what they're learning, and those of us who are practitioners or teachers, whatever our role, need to be actively engaged in figuring that out. And I would add one more. Do research in your own classroom. There's nothing I get more excited about than data from my students and just figuring out, what is the next step based on what we know.
Science is ever evolving, and so like we were kind of saying that before, not everything is settled. And so that's just something we need to be evolving to. And not that like one study comes out and we totally flip everything we're doing, right? Because you want to look at maybe a consensus, or that's why like a meta-analysis is so good, because it's going to look at more than one study. But looking at research and learning how to read it, that's a whole nother thing. That can be hard. There's a book that this is reminding me I want to go back and read again. It's called The Goldilocks Map, which is wonderful. I think it's Andrew Watson, is wonderful for teaching teachers how to approach research.
There is another one, and it's brown, and I never know the name of it, but it has to do with how do we know to trust the experts? Is that the title?
Kind of like the Goldilocks Map.
Yeah, they're very similar. I read them together a couple of years ago. It was very beneficial. That could be a whole other episode, which I think it needs to be. So our time for this episode, unfortunately, is coming to a close. But we like to thank you all for joining us today. And I would personally love to continue this conversation about how we can bridge research to practice. And so reach out to us if you have any ideas or experiences, things that you've learned in your own classroom or from researchers, or if you are a researcher, help us out here. Okay, well, thank you again for joining us for another episode of Literacy Talks.
Thanks for listening to Literacy Talks, the podcast series for literacy leaders and champions everywhere. Literacy Talks comes to you and your colleagues from Reading Horizons, where reading momentum begins. Visit readinghorizons.com/literacy talks often for resources, ideas, and great literacy learning conversations. Subscribe to our podcast digest, and you'll always be up to date on all things literacy. See you next time.